Hey, my name is Steve Hinton, and I serve as a pastor and author.
And I'm your co-host, Matthias. I serve as a personal trainer and a volunteer at my local church.
We want to welcome you to The Man Identity, a podcast that is dedicated to calling up young men into purposeful manhood, which is ultimately found in Jesus Christ and being made in the image of God.
In a culture that is often deliberately set against young men, we're here to intentionally build hope, clarity, and strength into the hearts of these men who are searching for purpose. Together, we will face tough issues head-on, throw down some weekly challenges, and have some fun along the way.
Because solid manhood is not automatic, but rather it's a choice. We're here to walk alongside you and encourage you to live out your authentic identity in being made in the image of God for a purpose larger than you have ever imagined.
So join us now for another episode of The Man Identity. Welcome, everyone, back to another episode of The Man Identity. Today, we've got a pretty special guest that I know Steve's been looking forward to for a while now to speak with. It's kind of been an inspiration for him. So, Steve, why don't you give us a little insight as to who this is today we got?
Well, Matthias, you are spot on just thinking about who our guest is today. A lot of our shows, Matthias, I'm really hoping that they will not be guest-driven, but content-driven. And I love the times that you and I are able to just unpack things and discuss. But there is a connection to the entire podcast. Our guest today is a gentleman by the name of Justin Brierley. He's a British guy. And I love the way British people, they say brilliant, when something's good.
Yeah.
And Justin is a brilliant man. I would say that he would be an apologist. I'm not sure he would describe himself that way, but an apologist is someone who gives answers for the Christian faith. Justin is a graduate of Oxford University, has been married to his bride, Lucy, for, about 25 years. And he has a podcast entitled The Surprising Rebirth and Believe in God. Now, here's the connection. As we've said before, I had been thinking about doing this podcast, for about 10 years. And as things begin to pick up speed, I received a text from one of my buddies in Indiana, Rick Grover. He's the lead minister at a great church in Indianapolis called East 91st Street Christian Church. But I received a text from Rick back in March with a link to the podcast series by Justin Brierley, in particular, an episode entitled The Male Identity Crisis. And it was a brilliant piece of work. It was not simply Justin interviewing people or giving data, but he orchestrated. He put all these pieces together in a very beautiful way. And as I listened to that, I thought, oh my goodness, he is spot on talking about the present crisis, spot on talking about the answers. And that really caused me, Matthias, to say, okay, I need to do this. Looking at the article that I wrote on Andrew Tate earlier in the year, looking at some conversations I had when I actually got to go to England in May with Markman for Christ. And then you and I began to talk about putting this thing together, and we prayed about it. But after we launched our series, and I mentioned Justin in episode 1, audience, go ahead and go back to and listen to that, our kickoff, our maiden voyage. And shortly after that, I reached out to Justin and I thanked him. And I asked him if he would consider being a guest on the podcast. And he graciously said yes. And I would challenge guys on that too. If you have an idea, reach out. Sometimes you're going to take a risk and you're going to get told no. But sometimes you're going to get an open door, and Justin graciously did that. He's a brilliant. He's brilliant. Justin is a brilliant man, and I was able to just ask him some questions about his books, about his discussions that he has had with atheists and agnostics and believers, and I think it just really fits in. We have a male identity crisis. And part of the problem, Matthias, is that we have a cultural crisis. In other words, this male identity crisis that we have right now, it didn't just come out of nowhere. It came out of dismantling the Western culture. And Justin was able to tap into that. But before we got into business, I asked Justin about his father because I remember reading in his books just the example that his father gave to him. His father is a scientist, but a strong believer. So yes, I'm very grateful for the discussion I had with Justin, and I'm excited for our listeners to hear it, and then you and I to discuss it.
Sounds good.
Well, Justin, I am really excited to talk with you. I remember, wow, back in March, I got a text from one of my buddies up in Indiana, and his name's Rick, and he knew that I had been reaching out to young men and trying to encourage young men for a long time. And he sent me a text with your episode, season number 2, on the rediscovering or the surprising rebirth in God. And the particular episode was on the male identity crisis. And I thought that is just spot on for what we need today. And it's interesting, Justin, I credit you, partially you, for my pulling the trigger to do this podcast. I had been thinking about doing this sort of thing really for about 12 years because I had a heart to answer the questions that people have. I mean, can we trust the Bible? Are there solid evidences for creation, for God, things of that nature? And earlier in the year, last year, I received an invite from renew.com, which is a great online Christian journal, to write an article about Andrew Tate. And I did that, and looking at that article and then looking at the providential timing of your episode dropping into my lap, I thought, okay, this is it. This is the confirmation that I need. And I just want to thank you for the work that you're doing. I was able to pick up 2 of your books, Why I'm Still a Christian After 10, I guess maybe now 20 years, and the book form itself, The Surprising Belief in God. And Justin, this is helpful, but also I just kind of want to hear some of your heart. You talked a little bit about your father, and I know there's so much value in the connection between a dad and a son, and a lot of times we get our first impressions about who God is or what God is because of our father. And before we get into the business end of things, Justin, tell me about your dad. Tell me about the relationship you had with your father, and how that influences your life today and your heart to reach people and connect people with God today.
Yeah. Oh, it's a great question. And I think one of the key things is, really seeing a strong Christian faith in my father definitely made a difference to me, and taking it seriously myself as I was growing up. I think seeing a man, on his knees next to his bed with the Bible open when you're a young boy does make a difference. You see this is important. This is what he does. And so there's absolutely no doubt, that all of that stuff will have been formative. And then, just being able to ask questions as I was growing up. My dad was a scientist. He had a background in chemistry and engineering, and so I was able to go to him with my questions, as I grew up and started to put together the pieces of science and faith and that kind of thing. It would often be when we were, driving to school or back again. And all of those sorts of moments were very important as I started to put the pieces of faith together for myself. And one thing I really value is he always taught me the value of asking questions. And, he wouldn't say, this is the only way to think about it, but, you need to go and explore these things for yourself. So I felt that was a really good basis in which to do it. So, yeah, I mean, like any father, not perfect, but absolutely, someone that I was so glad to have, a good, stable kind of role model in my life in that kind of way. And I can understand how difficult it is when you don't have that. I think it is an extraordinary privilege to be able to have that in your life.
Justin, in your book on Why I'm Still a Christian, there's a section on, and I'm messing the title up, but just re-examining or rethinking, maybe getting a new view of science. In other words, the model is that science and faith are estranged from one another. They're divorced from one another. But the reality is that you look at some of the greatest scientists in the world, back to Kelvin and Kepler, they believed in God, but you had a whole section on that. And can you unpack that a little bit? And it is interesting to hear about the fact that your father is a scientist, but he's a firm believer in God. He was even praying. But what can we learn about what true science is, and just rethinking it, because we've got the Richard Dawkins on this end, or whomever, but what are a couple of reality checks that we need to have? On
Absolutely. Well, I think we've been told a story for a long time by a lot of the leading voices or public voices from science saying science and faith are somehow at odds with each other. And this is a very new kind of way of looking at the relationship between science and faith. To be honest, it's a story that has been incredibly exaggerated. Certain episodes from history around Galileo and others, putting them purportedly at odds with the church, are simply just not good readings of history if you actually go back and look at the actual incidents that are involved. What I've discovered, if you actually go and properly research the history of science and faith, is you will find that all of the scientific pioneers of the scientific revolution of the sort of 16th century onwards were firm believers. That just is the fact, and indeed, it wasn't just incidental to their science that they happened to be Christians and believers, but it was actually, it pushed forward the fact that they wanted to do science. They wanted to explore the universe. They saw it as a divine mandate from God, the creator, that there was a designer who had given them a universe of orderly laws that could be explored. This was, and what's important to notice is that the scientific revolution only happened in the Christian West. There were lots of other kind of technological sort of, advances in other parts of the world, in China, in parts of, Muslim world. But you never got what we experienced, which is the scientific revolution, this idea of being able to methodically engage and test the world in order to understand more about it. And that is, and again, if you go and read the histories of science, you will find it's precisely because they believed in a God of order, in a God who had specifically revealed himself in the workings of the universe, that these Christian pioneers were able to go and do the work that they did. And they explicitly made that very clear in the books that they produced, and the way that they did everything they did to the glory of God. So this idea that science and faith have been in conflict is essentially a modern myth. It's just never been the case. And indeed, the church has frequently been the sponsor of, a lot of that scientific advance over the years. In more recent years, people have started to throw up various things, making claims that, the book of Genesis is out of kilter with what we know of modern science. And obviously we need to read Genesis carefully, and we need to understand it in its context. But the reality is, I would say the last several decades, the last generation or so of modern science has actually pointed towards God in a way that almost nothing else has, actually. In the book, in both my books, I talk about a number of scientific advances, what we know about the universe and our place in the universe specifically, that really do actually open up the God question rather than closing it down. So whether you're looking at the past or you're looking at the present, I think there's every reason to see that actually faith and God make perfect sense of science rather than being at odds with each other.
I'm glad that you brought that up. And that had kind of been my understanding, that you look at the early scientists and they had a worldview that we are created in the image of God, that God's rational, therefore creation's rational. And because we have rational minds, that we are almost invited to come explore God, which kind of birthed science. When you look at your amazing history there in the UK with Oxford, I guess my understanding is that many of those just world-renowned institutions of science, and even the ones in Paris, were actually begun by men of faith, that we're going to explore reason. And we don't see that sort of thing popping up a lot in the Muslim world or the Oriental world with a different worldview.
Absolutely. And, I think C.S. Lewis put it very pithily when he said, men became scientific because they believed in a divine legislator who had invested the universe with reason and order. And as you say, that really didn't exist in the same way in other cultures and other religions. Interestingly, specifically, the Protestant sort of Reformation also birthed a certain kind of way of looking at the universe, because in many ways, people like Boyle and Locke and other scientific pioneers felt that they had been given a mandate, if you like, to almost through science correct some of the deficiencies that came with the fall. They understood the world and our ability to understand it as very much impaired by sin and by the way that the fall had kind of had this outworking on humans and the rest of creation. But the scientific enterprise, the reason they created microscopes and telescopes to be able to understand and look at, the tiniest parts of life and the furthest reaches of the universe was almost as a corrective to, and it was, they saw this as part of their kingdom initiative, if you like, to sort of overcome the effects of the fall with God's help and grace. So even that, there's been some fascinating work done on the way that those very theological beliefs help to inspire Christians to go out and explore the world in that way. That's often a narrative you don't hear, as I say, in the popular sort of imagination. And then, again, moving on to those modern sort of aspects of faith, I'm increasingly meeting more and more scientists today who are really now parting company with the Richard Dawkins and others, who are these very, atheist-minded scientists. More and more scientists, even if they're not calling themselves Christians specifically, they're acknowledging that there's something going on, in the universe that means it has this directionality towards us and towards comprehending our place in the universe. So one person who I've had this kind of conversation with is Paul Davies, who's a very, brilliant scientist and a very popular level scientist as well. He's written best-selling books and been on TV series about science. But he acknowledges there's something about the universe that suggests there's a meaning behind it, that we're not here by accident.
Right.
That there's a purpose behind, all of the things that it took for us to be here in the universe. Now, he struggles to call that God, but I would say that directionality, as he puts it, in the universe from matter to comprehension, I think there's a great Greek word that expresses that, and it's logos. It's this idea of meaning coming out of disorder, chaos from non-existence, life from non-existence, order from chaos. And of course, it's the word that is used of Jesus Christ as the
John 1:1.
Yeah, the pre-existent word of God that brought all things into being. It's that even scientists can recognize that there's a principle at work in the universe. And I think we have a name for that, and it's Jesus.
Yeah.
So for me, when the best of science comes together with the biblical revelation, I think, that's an exciting time.
Well, can we run with that and maybe extrapolate a little bit, or maybe open up, unpack into the bigger picture? One of your sections, chapters, was just the fact that we have been shaped by a Christian story. So, I mean, we're just kind of focusing on science, but just looking at the worldview. And my understanding is, I'm not sure how it is there in the UK, but the courses in university, Western civilization is something that's not taught a whole lot anymore. That's kind of pushed aside. But that used to be a meat and potatoes, like a freshman level class. But you kind of touched on how that shapes us, and I found it interesting. You quoted or referenced an author by the name of Rodney Stark 2 or 3 times, and I was not aware of Stark until recently. In one of his books was The Rise of Christianity, which you referenced. But Justin, he also wrote another one entitled How the West Won, which makes me think of what you talked about a minute ago, that there are so many things that kind of arose in the West that did not in any other part of the world. And just what are the theological underpinnings of that? And then, so Justin, in addition to science, what are some other pieces of history that we can look at that point to a biblical worldview as its origins?
Well, Stark, was a brilliant academic and communicator, and I was fortunate to have an interview with him in his later years. I think the person in some ways who's taken on the mantle of Rodney Stark now is another historian called Tom Holland, not the Spider.
I've heard of him.
Holland. Yeah,
he wrote a big book, called Dominion. That's
Dominion. That's right, and it's called The Making of the Western Mind, in which he draws on a lot of Stark's ideas and many others. But where he really puts the pieces together as himself, kind of basically as an agnostic, and Stark was sort of, I think began as an agnostic and gradually found himself drawn towards the Christian faith at a personal level. But Tom Holland is very interesting because he's gone on a similar-ish journey. And his book Dominion sketches out that autobiographically. The book is subtitled The Making of the Western Mind. And let me sketch a picture, because I think this will help to frame the question you've got. Because Tom Holland himself, had a kind of nominal Christian upbringing, but any faith he had sort of sputtered out by the end of his, teenage years. And so he went on to this very successful career after university, publishing popular works of historical, not both novels and fact-based books, and essentially, got really into, the whole world of the Greeks and the Romans in the process. But he says the longer he spent time, as it were, in the sandals of the Greeks and the Romans, the more he realized how very alien their worldview was to his own. Because at the end of the day, as glamorous as these civilizations were, they were also incredibly cruel and barbaric, at least to our way of thinking in many ways. This was a world where the lives of women and children were relatively cheap. Children who were unwanted, be it because they were one too many, a girl, deformed in some way, they could simply be left at the side of the road for wild animals or strangers or whatever. This was a common practice called exposure in the Greco-Roman world, and it was completely accepted. And we think, gosh, how awful. But, that was the way they thought back then. You could look at the fact of slavery, which was just an absolutely de facto and assumed part of the economy. Up to a third of people in the Roman Empire would have been slaves. That, the civilization was essentially built on the back of slavery. And then you had things like, the fact that some people could also be the sexual property effectively of other people. A senior Roman male had his pick essentially of anyone who was his social inferior, whether they liked it or not, be they man, woman, boy or girl. And so Tom Holland sort of steps back from some of this stuff and asks himself, where did I, as a 21st century modern Western liberal person, get my beliefs in human equality and dignity, value, progress, compassion, freedom? Those beliefs obviously didn't come from the Greeks and the Romans. And I think he also understood those beliefs didn't come from science or atheism either. Those are sort of value neutral projects. He came to the conclusion in his book Dominion that his beliefs in equality, dignity, human rights, and so on, all came from a very specific place, in fact, a very specific person, Jesus Christ of Nazareth. And the movement that he began with his friends had ultimately completely turned the world upside down and reshaped the way we think about what it means to be human, to the extent that Tom Holland now will say said to me often in interviews, even though I struggle to believe the Christian story at one level, Justin, I recognize that in almost every other way I am a Christian, because I've been completely shaped by the worldview of Christianity. And so he is kind of, been very interestingly reminding his peers, secular peers, that the fact they believe in human rights didn't come out of nowhere. That's a very theological set of beliefs. If you believe in something called human rights, you won't find that in science. If you cut a person open, you won't find this thing called human rights. That's something we have put onto the world, and it's because of this Christian story that we've come to believe in those things. And really, ultimately, the awkward question Tom Holland is asking of his secular peers is, can we hold on to these beliefs in the absence of the Christian story? Because there are other worldviews out there. There are very different ways. There have been in the past, and there are today different ways of looking at human rights, equality, and all of those things. They are not a given in every culture by any stretch. And so how long can we hold on to the fruits of the Christian revolution without the roots of the story? If we jettison that story in the West, can we hold on to the values it gave us? So these are some of the interesting ways in which I think we're being reminded, even in our secular post-Christian age, that the fundamental values that built Western civilization are intimately linked to Christianity. And the question is, do we hold on to them without it?
Right. Well, okay. Let me ask you this question, and I have not completely thought this through. I've not done the research on it well enough, but I'm curious if there is a connection. One of the arguments against the church, against Christianity, is that real science and real life came from the Enlightenment period. Now, I know there's probably going to be a miss in a number of decades, maybe even 100 years, a century. But when is it that slavery was reintroduced into the Western world? In other words, prior to the Enlightenment, slavery had been eradicated from the West. But somewhere along that time, slavery came back in. And I'm just wondering, and this is just Steve wondering, is there any connection with this period of enlightenment that, hey, we can reason, we don't need God. There is a God, but we can reason through this. And somehow along these same lines, we lose the dignity of humanity to allow slavery to come in. Am I accurately connecting any dots there?
I think you're onto something there, because you're right. Essentially, obviously, slavery was, a de facto part of the ancient world, as I say, and it really was Christian influence that gradually brought slavery to an end in the West. And, by medieval times, slavery had effectively been outlawed. Now, obviously, the transatlantic slave trade came up in the 17th, 18th century on into the 19th century, and this has been a huge scar on Western civilization. Suddenly, this barbaric form of slavery re-entering the story. But you're right; it's interesting that it did coincide with the Enlightenment, effectively, which is arguably the point at which a certain number of intellectuals, philosophers, and thinkers started to try to divorce, if you like, morality and human reason from God. Now, I think, and again, Tom Holland has done a wonderful job of showing this himself, that the Enlightenment in many ways was absolutely a product of Christianity anyway, in terms of all the values they did espouse.
Everything that came up to that, everything that pushed to that.
It didn't appear out of a vacuum. They were very much borrowing from a lot of Christian principles in order to, for this to happen. But yeah, I do think, it's interesting, though, that a lot of those Enlightenment thinkers didn't have a problem with slavery or the idea that some people are less equal than other people. Because if you are simply turning to science or reason as your only tools, if you like, for looking at life, then you will quickly, sadly, lose the concept of human equality. Because, as I say, science itself won't reveal this world of human rights and so on. And so if you're starting to become a utilitarian, as John Stuart Mill was, or others were in that kind of Enlightenment period, you may be willing to sacrifice the rights of some humans for the sake of, what you see as the benefits of other humans. And there's lots of things that can happen when you take God out of the equation, you take away this fundamental belief that people are made in the image of God. If you believe people are made in the image of God, then that makes people ends in themselves. It doesn't make them simply an end for something else. It means that they have intrinsic value. And that has always at some level been a break on people who believed it, using people simply for whatever purpose they wish, because effectively you're doing something to someone who bears the image of God. As we lost that, as the Enlightenment kind of started to strip those theological ideas away, I think it did give people license to start to treat people as means to an end rather than as ends in themselves. So I think there's something to be said for what you said. Now, it's obviously a mixed picture, and inevitably there were some Enlightenment thinkers who went on to be part of the abolition movement, and there were others who were perfectly happy with slavery. So it's not that you can easily say all the Enlightenment thinkers went in one direction here.
Of course, yeah.
But what is significant is that abolition movement, which had to begin, was absolutely also front and center led by Christians. The Quakers, the Evangelicals, the Clapham sect, William Wilberforce, all of whom took their views against slavery not from Enlightenment thinking, but from the Bible, and said this will not stand, given what we have read here in Scripture. And so, to that extent, Christianity, I think, had to bring an end to slavery twice, effectively, in the ancient world and in the modern world.
Right. So we're talking about the man identity, and I'm so thankful that you've brought those topics up, that we're created in the image of God. Looking at our present culture here in the West, the U.S., the U.K., Germany, Switzerland, Canada, other places, there appears to be this problem that we have a culture that is moved further away from a biblical worldview, and we're wrestling with the problems now. And Justin, in the article that I wrote about Andrew Tate, and it was I researched that really pretty well. I came across a British journal, The Guardian, and The Guardian referenced that up to a fifth of Gen Z men in the UK have a favorable impression of Andrew Tate. And if you don't know who Andrew Tate is, listeners, you go back to listen to episode 1 or any, Justin's excellent episode on the male identity crisis. But Justin, in your opinion, living there in the UK, would that be about accurate? And then the follow-up question, why? Why are so many young men following a guy that just has no care for anybody except for himself?
I fear that it probably is accurate. I'm not sure when that article came out, and the picture may have changed a bit in the intervening time. But yeah, sadly, I really became aware a few years ago of just how prevalent Andrew Tate's thinking was, because I have a couple of teenage sons. In fact, my oldest son is now 20 years old, but at the time he was sort of around 16, 17.
Mm-hmm.
And I just remember, as I was starting to hear about this character Andrew Tate, asking my oldest son Noah, what are you hearing about this? And he was saying, yeah, actually a lot of my friends watch his stuff. And I was pretty shocked, because I think sometimes we can be a bit sheltered, parents, adults, from what is actually being consumed by a lot of young people. And I think Andrew Tate, sadly, he's just made for TikTok. He's the reason, and I'm sure I know that you've covered this as well in your article and series yourself, he's become so influential among young men, is because there are so many young men looking for some kind of mentor, someone who can give them a sense of identity and purpose. And in a sense, Andrew Tate, in a very kind of viral, engaging way, offers that to young men. But obviously he offers all the wrong kinds of leadership and example, because he makes it all about himself, or all about you dominating, controlling, and getting what you want. And it's an incredibly selfish, self-fulfilling kind of a way, and which is, as we know, very misogynistic in the way it's expressed. The problem is he has a ready audience for that, because our culture is tipped so far in the other direction, because so many young men find themselves without an identity. And so often masculinity, as far as it's ever portrayed in the media, is portrayed as toxic and dangerous and so on. It just leaves a lot of young men thinking, well, I've been rejected, I don't have a base, I don't have any, so a lot of them, out of frustration, just looking for something that'll mean something to them, they find themselves attracted, and sometimes sadly, to these very negative voices. So it doesn't surprise me too much that many young men, because I think young men, they're looking for something that feels real, and I think they can, their BS detector is pretty high, and when in the general culture they're being told a lot of things that just don't resonate with who they are, they're going to go and find someone who feels like they does get them. And I think that's the thing, and a lot of them feel like he gets me, and young men are, especially at that time of their life, they're in a kind of period where there's a certain kind of rebellion about being a teenager and so on, and there's something edgy about listening to the provocative, edgy voices, and obviously Andrew Tate does that. And so I can understand why he's kind of been attractive in that way for young men who feel disempowered, disillusioned, with what they've been given. The question is, how do we counteract that? The problem is, if all we have to offer is he's a terrible person, and you mustn't watch his, that only tends to, I think, exacerbate the problem. It doesn't actually help. What we need to do is offer a better story than the Andrew Tate story, not just simply yet again pile on disapproval into these young men's lives. That the reason they turned to Andrew Tate in the first place was because essentially they feel like society disapproves of them. So I think we have to be very careful about the way we respond to that.
Well, and I agree. It was interesting that in all the research I did for that, there was indeed a lot of writing about how Andrew Tate's off and he's bad, he's misogynist, but there wasn't a whole lot of, okay, here's the positive thing to do. And from our discussion today, I think we can turn the imagination of young men back to a biblical worldview, that this does work, but ultimately to Jesus. And if I can share a quote, this is from your episode number 8. Why young men are returning to Christ. And I don't know who John Tyson is. I'm going to have to look him up. But you were talking to John, and he made this statement that I thought was pretty good, that you resemble what you revere. You resemble what you revere. And his whole point being is that if we revere Jesus, we're going to begin to resemble him. And a lot of times people have this, they have different ideas about who Jesus is. But Justin, what are some reasons why young men need to give a serious consideration for Jesus Christ, and not just academically, but personally, that Jesus is the role model that I'm looking for. He's my savior, but he's my role model. What are some reasons that young men need to give Jesus a serious look?
I think one of the reasons, and this I think can appeal both to people who find themselves inside the church or outside the church, is that Jesus simply is the most influential person who has ever lived. Now, I believe as a Christian, he also died and rose again. But
Right,
if you kind of have question marks over that, you cannot deny historically that he is by far the most influential person. We literally mark history before and after him. And so to that extent, there is every reason why you should take Jesus seriously, and you should do your best to find out who this person is. And specifically, was he the person he claimed to be in the scriptures? Because this is not just a sort of take it or leave it kind of person. This was someone who made very specific, very radical claims about who he was and what following him entails. This is a person who claimed to be the word incarnate. I am, before Abraham was, I am. This is someone who takes on divine authority in claiming to be able to forgive sins. This is someone who said essentially, I am your Lord and Savior. Now, if that's true, that isn't someone we can just sort of look at, as Lewis said, as a good moral teacher. He really hasn't left that option open to us.
I was wondering if you were going to say anything about your British mate, C.S.
Well, yeah, I'm a big fan, as you probably know if you've read my
Yeah.
books. I quote him an awful lot. But C.S. Lewis, famously had this trilemma. Jesus is either a liar, lunatic, or Lord.
Mhm.
Only a madman would make the kind of claims Jesus said if they weren't true, or he was a very good liar and inveigled a lot of people into following him. Or if neither of those options seem viable, then maybe he was who he said he was. He was Lord. And the point is, he hasn't left the options open to us of simply being a good moral teacher, which a lot of people want Jesus to be.
Mhm.
That he's saying he's much more than that. He is a good moral teacher, but he's not just a good moral teacher. So anyway, I just think, just on that level, you should take Jesus seriously. But when you do start taking Jesus seriously, what you will find there is someone who modeled the most extraordinary kind of manhood and masculinity, not the misogynist, selfish kind that Andrew Tate embodies,
Mhm.
but the kind which encouraged, in which he and those who followed him went out to live extraordinarily self-sacrificial lives. And that is the difference. True masculinity is about sacrifice. It's about showing the kind of love that you embody means that you lay down your life for the sake of other people. That's where you will find a truly kind of masculine, if you will. And that's so Jesus, let's remember, never had a wife or a partner, never had sex with anyone. If those are the things you're measuring masculinity by, then you've got entirely the wrong measure. Actually, it's not that those things are bad. In the right context, we've been given a glorious opportunity to express God's love and wholeness and abundance through marriage and sex. But Jesus said you can be a real man and never have had a sexual partner in your life. There's something about masculinity that is much more important than that. And John Tyson is a great person to go to on these issues. If you haven't come across him, he just runs a wonderful ministry. He's a pastor in New York. He's written several books on masculinity, and he's developed a wonderful program that kind of effectively is a Christian-based rites of passage for young men. And I think what he recognizes is that in the modern world, we've lost a lot of those key milestones and rites of passage that served men and young men in their walk, both simply as people growing up and going into the different stages of life, but also recognizing the spiritual journey that involves. And so he has sort of developed a really helpful way of reintegrating that into life. And again, the way he put it is, Jesus is the best example we could ever have been given of what true masculinity looks like. And the good news for me, Steve, is that I think despite the Andrew Tate effect, there are actually a lot of young men who are starting to realize this. Here in the UK, we've seen an extraordinary rise in the number of young men starting to come to church, starting to investigate the Christian story. This has been the missing demographic in our churches for a long, long time. And yet,
I'm experiencing that in the church where I'm at here in Houston as well.
Yeah. And so I think something's getting through. I think, there's a trickle-down effect from a lot of the interesting influencers who are talking about the Bible again, talking about Jesus again. Just met a young guy at my church a couple of weeks ago who he'd kind of had a loose connection with our church, going back, I probably last saw him when he was 8 or 9, at a kind of, we have a uniformed organization who meets, and he'd been there. He's just started turning up again in his early 20s now. And he's got all kinds of questions, and he wants to know about Jesus. And I've been sending him, episodes of conversations with Tom Holland and N.T. Wright, and he's just fascinated. And he's just one example of, I think, these young men who are realizing there's more to life than what I've been handed.
Right.
I need to investigate this again and give it a fresh look. And I'm very encouraged by that.
Justin, we've referenced these other guys, and I'm grateful that you brought up Into Right, and I'm looking forward to your interview with John Lennox. But let's talk about your work. Unbelievable. If there's someone out there and they're thinking, hey, I want to get Justin's book, or I want to listen to his podcast, or where can people find you? Where can people get more information from what you've done?
Well, my website is a good place to begin, justinbrierley.com. You can find my books there. You can find links to the various podcasts that I host and have hosted in the past from justinbrierley.com. So that's a good place to go. Some of the big kind of, if you are just like to just look up podcasts online, one of the main ones I've been involved in is the same title as one of my books. That's The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And that's, as you already mentioned, where I featured this past season a couple of episodes looking at the male identity crisis and so on. But the bigger theme, if you like, of the podcast, and from season 1 onwards, has been charting this really interesting rise and fall of new atheism. First of all, this very sort of anti-God philosophical public movement that began in the sort of mid 2000s, and the way in which that really did capture public attention for a long time, but then kind of faded from view as well. And I think there are all kinds of cultural, sociological reasons for that. Ultimately, down to the fact that people, I think, were looking for better answers than those new atheists were able to offer them. And so I chart the rise of a whole new set of intellectual figures, not always Christians by any means, but people who are nevertheless pointing people back to the value of faith. So I've already mentioned Tom Holland, the British historian, as one of those, but you could also add people like Douglas Murray, the British journalist, Jordan Peterson, the Canadian psychologist, and a whole host of other characters who are these influencers who are essentially reminding their listeners and viewers that we need something to believe in. And in the absence of the Christian story, have we got a better story to replace that? And a lot of them are actually people who were quite often part of that new atheist movement, were quite interested in it, but came to see it did not provide the kind of story that people could make sense of their lives through. So I've just been fascinated to see the way the public conversation on God has changed quite dramatically. And so when I began my Unbelievable show, which again, you can find, 17 plus years of archive stuff on there from me hosting conversations between Christians and atheists over many years. I moved on from the show just a couple of years ago, but nonetheless, in the time I was there, nearly 2 decades, I just saw these conversations shift from this very sort of very kind of combative new atheist phase, where I was bringing on these Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins type characters, opposite Christian thinkers, to that movement sort of sputtering out and being replaced by these far more nuanced conversations with secular thinkers like Jordan Peterson, but very often saying very Christian things, ironically. And so that was really that shift in the public conversation is what led me to write the book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and then the podcast series that accompanies it. But what I hadn't been expecting, or at least not to happen so quickly, was for there to be a real shift on the ground. And I think it has filtered down surprisingly fast to people on the ground, and now coming out, I think, in some of the extraordinary statistics we're seeing in the UK, certainly, of young people apparently taking a renewed interest in faith because they're not satisfied with the answers of a secular culture. So it's been a really interesting few years tracing, this change in the cultural conversation and what's happening on the ground.
That's exciting, and I want our listeners to look at that. But I want to ask you this last question, and I usually do this, Justin. But if you had a young man in front of you and you only had one shot to give him 1 or 2 pieces of advice, what would they be?
I would want to say, what do you want your legacy to be? Perhaps firstly, what do you want your legacy to be? Because that gives you a kind of a bigger picture. I think we live in very short-term thinking a lot of the time at the moment. But thinking about how would I like to be remembered? What do I want to leave behind? I think helps a young man to think about what his ultimate values and priorities should be, and whether he's pursuing those. And secondly, I would want to say, what do you make of the person of Jesus? because, as I said earlier, you cannot ignore the extraordinary legacy of that person.
Mhm.
You know, if you're looking at legacy, he has by far and away been the most influential person and has left the biggest mark in history in the world. But then you look at him, he was only in public ministry for 3 years. He never wrote down a word. He never commanded an army. He never established, you know, some great hall of public thinking. You know, no one erected monuments in his honor in his lifetime. He never married. He never had children. He died the death of a rebel slave, a shameful death. And yet this man has left the most remarkable legacy of any human being who ever lived. And I would just want to say, so if you're thinking about legacy, maybe you need to look at who this person was and try to understand why he left such a legacy. And I think if you do that, you'll discover not only someone who left an extraordinary legacy, but the reason they left that legacy was because of who they were. And if we want our legacy to count for anything, it's worth us knowing who this person is and perhaps experiencing the kind of life he offers. So that might be where I would go.
You know, I really liked that you started off with the question about his dad. I think something there's men like that who I know lots of good friends of mine that look up to their father, and of course I respect and admire my real dad, my stepdad for a lot of different things that they did for me. They're amazing, but there's just something about a kid and his dad in an unbroken family, right? That I think people like you and me, we kind of miss what that's supposed to be or what that feels like. Yeah. Which gives us an amazing opportunity to change that. But all that to say is I like that you started off with that question, because when he started talking about his dad being a scientist, I was like, oh man, like I started kind of feeling something inside, because before I was a personal trainer, I was in research for about 4.5 years, and that's what I thought I wanted to do. So, you know, I was an exercise sports scientist, and you know, I stopped doing that, but it made me think about myself and how my children would see me. And I was like, man, I hope my kids look up to me like that. So I thought that was a good foundation to start this with, because that is kind of the basis of what our podcast is kind of meant for, is filling that gap.
We want to encourage those guys that don't have that identity built into them.
Yeah. So we're just trying to fill that gap of the men that don't have that identity, or just feeling like they're missing that piece or missing something, and, finding direction and trying to fill that gap there and give some good information, good advice, and just a good place to go to. Sit down, have a coffee, have a beer, whatever, like you said in the first episode. Go back and watch the first episode.
There you are.
Yeah, so I like that you started with that. That was great, just to hear his perspective on that, and kind of, I think that leads into the conversation of, the culture, but how science and culture are intertwined here. And if we look at the scientists back then, he brought up the point of, and especially when I was growing up, there was like a huge thing of, science, disproves God, or, God is antithetical to science. Well, it's like,
right.
I kind of grew up with the view of, well, if God created everything, science isn't going to contradict it. That was just my logical reasoning as a young kid. And so when I kind of got into my science realm, I saw it as, I'm getting to explore, kind of like he described, getting to explore the world that God gave us, that he created, and that we dwell in, to be able to explore. It's like, I don't know, it's almost like I see it as a little game he made for his children to go and find things, So that's how I've seen it. And I know that humanity, even, before, like he's talking about the scientists way back when, I don't know the different eras or, ages of this or ages of that, but talking about how they use things to basically kind of have that same mindset in the scientific realm. And I know that you have some examples. Kepler, is it?
Yeah, and I wrote about Kepler in one of my blog posts, and I thought that was beautiful that Johannes Kepler, astronomer, and at one point in time, he reasoned that the constellations, or for example, I think it's like Venus and Saturn, and one other planet, they kind of come together every 800 years, and it was his hypothesis that that event, which happens about every 800 years or so, may have been the star that the wise men followed in Matthew chapter 2. All that to say is that this idea that science, real science as opposed to God, that's actually a relatively new deal.
Yeah.
And it was really fun to hear Justin talk about the evolution of science, or the growth of science. That science actually grew in the Western world by men who believed in God, and the theological connection to that, this understanding that God is a rational being. God created rational rules of
Yeah.
nature. He created us in His image. We are rational beings. We can figure things out. Therefore, and I kind of like the way said that. As a child trying to figure things out. I think there's some truth to that. That because we're created in the image of God, we are able. Matter of fact, we're kind of expected to look at creation and understand it. And I think that was part of the idea of a lot of those early scientists, that we want to figure out what God has created. And that just created almost a snowball effect. I think about the Baconian scientific method. Sir
Mhm.
Francis Bacon, he was a believer in God. And there are these principles for doing science. Well, all of those principles came from men of God. And as science got bigger and bigger and bigger, we forget the fact that the men who kicked that off were followers of God. They believed in God. And that led to the scientific universities, that led to Oxford, and even the university system is something that came from scientists and godly men. And the reality that those institutions are something that we found first in the West. We didn't find those in Asian countries, Asian cultures. We didn't find those in Africa. We found those in the West, and it should cause us to rethink science. That it's not something opposed to God. And I liked it that Justin brought up the reality that a number of scientists today, even though they may not be what the Bible calls a born again Christian, they recognize the design.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny because I've never really thought about like human rationalization. And
Mhm.
it's funny we talk about this today in this episode because I have a friend who, he grew up Christian. He's been a Christian, but I think he hasn't been super active in his faith. Um, you know, and something he's been really diving into lately is actually apologetics. It's got him on
Mm.
fire for his faith. Is he's diving into like learning all the apologetics, speaking to Muslims, speaking to Mormons. He's learning it in all different aspects of
Right.
and he's like learned a lot about the history. All that to say is we were having a conversation last night. Just he was telling me he's like if he's explaining all these rationalizations. And it's like my area of interest is like just theological things and systems. And it's like hearing him get all excited about this, I'm like, man, maybe I need to start diving into apologetics and learning all these things too. But
Or have him listen to this podcast.
yeah, that too. And it was just interesting that the Lord really, it's like I just don't see how people can fight that He gave us a rational mind. Like if He's a rational God who gave us rational minds to be able to think critically about things.
Mhm, mhm.
I don't know. It was just an interesting aspect to me because I've never really thought like, because now that I'm seeing all this stuff can be rationalized, looking at the history, looking at of the apologetics of the Christian faith, I'm like, it really is rational. At least I used to think, it's just, it's faith. It's just, you just got to believe. And I'm like,
Right. And that's what a lot of people would say is that faith is just, just blind faith,
Mhm.
faith. Well, there's an element of faith because I can't see it, but
Right.
it's not irrational.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I just like that. This is like another kind of tidbit of maybe the Lord's leading me to study out some more apologetic stuff because of who we also have today, Justin Brierley.
Mhm.
But yeah, I just wanted to bring that up. Sorry, I think I might have cut you off there a little bit.
I don't think so. You mentioned history, and Justin talked about the way that the West was shaped by the Christian story. So not just science, but all of culture,
Yeah.
and that is in opposition to something that's been going on for a number of decades. There's this reference to the Middle Ages as being the Dark Ages. In other words, everything was glorious during the Roman Empire, and Rome fell, and the church was the fault of that, and things got dark. And I love that he brought up Tom Holland. And there are other authors, other researchers, one by the name of Rodney Stark, who has passed away. But Rodney Stark wrote a book called The Rise of Christianity, and then another one that I really enjoyed reading called How the West Won. But he mentioned Tom Holland, and going back and looking at Rome, And Rome had a pretty good military. Rome knew how to make concrete. Rome knew all these sort of logistical things. But Rome, did you catch that? And I think Brierly was right that about a third of the Roman Empire were slaves.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, okay, what kind of human rights do you have there? And just this reality that the idea of human rights, that didn't come from Rome, that didn't come from science, that didn't come from Hinduism, that didn't come from Islam. The idea of human rights and creating the image of God and human value, that came only from the Christian history that we find in the Western world.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that he talked about it, because in the aspect of slavery, it was, it was basically gone for a while, came back, and then because of Christian values again in the West, gone again. And I know that there's, lots of different nuances and things like that. But it's just that, yeah, without the Christian worldview, I think I haven't listened to many debates. Like I said, apologetics is not my big area of expertise. But there was one quote that I heard from a debate snippet that I listened to is when the atheist was arguing with the opponent, the Christian said, "Well, you have to borrow from my worldview to think that way." And I at first I was like, I guess, yeah, without having to borrow from the Christian worldview, his morality, what basis does it have? It doesn't. So I never thought about it like that, and I know that's like the simplest of concepts, but I was like, wow, everything does come from an objective truth. So if to the atheist there is no objective truth,
right?
Everything's subjective. So it's like, okay, well, where does it come from then? It's gotta be borrowed from the Christian worldview or some other worldview. But the aspect of the human rights that comes from the Christian worldview. And so that was just so is there a certain time, because you're the big history buff, right?
Well, I like history. I don't know it all, and I always have to reference specific dates. But you can look at from the fall of Rome in the 400s, things dates around there. You had the division of the Roman Empire, you had the East and the West. But when everything fell apart, Europe broke into these states, and these states are warring with each other. But where Christianity came into those areas, it just shaped culture, and it did. It eradicated slavery. It gave the rise to science. It gave the rise to inventions, and this is the way things were going. And I thought about this when Justin and I were talking about the Enlightenment period. And again, a lot of modern thinking is Rome was great, Dark Ages, and then everything came back in the Enlightenment. And I was thinking, well, okay, that's interesting, because that's about the time that slavery kind of re-entered the Western world. But I also thought about this. There's a difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, which wasn't too far after that, and then the Russian Revolution, which was 100 years after that.
Yeah.
That in the American Revolution, there was an element of divine truth. There was an element of, you even read the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. They're inalienable rights. When you go to the French Revolution, it was incredibly bloody. They're guillotined, heads off people, and there were purges and murders, and it was just bad. And then you get to the Russian Revolution in the early 20th century. That was incredibly insane. That they lined up the Tsar and his wife and kids, and they just murdered them all. And the point being is that the difference between the American Revolution, Russian Revolution, and the French Revolution was this idea of God. The French Revolution, again, coming out of the Enlightenment, that we don't need God, we're rational without God. Okay, well, you also lose human rights, and we're gonna execute this person because we don't think they're valuable anymore.
Yeah, just lose that basis for morality,
right?
Yes, and it's evident, and like you said, it's evident. Without it, things start to go a different direction.
And I think that kind of comes to where we're at today in the West and America, that we've had 5, 6, maybe 7 decades of this slow erosion of a biblical worldview that affects our families, affects the way we do culture. And then you have all of these young men who don't have an identity in themselves because they're living in a culture without identity.
Mhm.
They have, fewer men speaking into their lives, giving them purpose. And we live in a culture where purpose is just kind of defined by, whoever has the biggest stick. So it was good to see Justin talk about this reemergence of belief. And, sometimes it's like Jordan Peterson, who is on one hand acknowledging, hey, there's something there to that biblical worldview, but yet he's unwilling to
make that leap.
in his own heart. And,
Mhm.
if I had an opportunity to talk to Peterson, I'd probably ask him about that. But Justin talked about reasons why young men need to give Jesus a serious look.
Mhm.
And I thought he had good things to say there as well on that point.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, from in my perspective, I've always had this kind of feeling of like I need to fulfill something great. And now that I've had a good amount of experience as an adult with a wife and kids, it's like there's even the great purpose of having children and raising them up. It's null and void without the eternal.
Mm,
It's meaningless without that.
mhm,
And
mhm.
so I think
And
that
that's just being honest.
yeah, and I know this. We've said this in multiple episodes of the podcast, but Ecclesiastes says that God put eternity in the hearts of man.
Yeah.
That
yeah.
I know
Yes.
the people that don't believe, they have this longing, they have this emptiness, but that can only be found in Christ.
Mhm, mhm.
Because that longing for something lasting, something eternal, something that isn't gonna just pass away when we die. So I think that. Sorry, I kind of went on a little tangent there about just the returning and talking about young men, because that's what's given me purpose as a man. It's like seeing, okay, the things I do, they matter for generations to come, and then also in the eternal.
Mhm, mhm.
That gives me ultimate fulfillment and purpose. And I'm not saying I wake up every day like a cheerleader, super pepped up and ready to go and excited.
It's tough. It's tough.
Right,
some
it's
days.
tough, but but it's like I know it has a purpose. I can know my pain, I can know my suffering, I can know the mundane, I can know all the hardships have a
Mhm,
reason.
mhm.
The good times, the bad times, they all have a reason. Everything's got its purpose, its time. So I think without that, young men are really struggling to find identity, especially when the world's telling them you should feel guilty for just being a man, essentially. You know?
And we noted in the podcast, that's why guys like Andrew Tate step up, because in our emotional, spiritual DNA as guys, there's this hunger to go produce, to go make things right. And there's a little bit of violence in a good way in that. So boys don't know how to control that, and they're pressed down and they're told they're bad. And then somebody like Andrew Tate gets up and says, no, get up, be a man. But he's doing that with a very hedonistic
Yeah.
mind frame instead of, and Justin touched on that. Real manhood is about service.
Yeah.
Real man
Absolutely.
is service. And I like the way he directed guys to Jesus Christ.
Mhm.
You want to know what a real man is? Well, that's Jesus.
Yeah.
That's Jesus. He's the divine Son of God. We find our hope and salvation in him. But he lived manhood perfectly. He nobody pushed his buttons. He had his own agenda, and I think there's beauty in that.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll touch on this one last thing before we either move on or finish up this conversation. But we actually talked about that. You said, real man is a man of service, right?
Mhm.
And it's like our entire episode we did a couple episodes back where it was just me and you. After talking
That
about,
was a good episode.
yeah, it was just about manhood, being prepared for marriage, and being the man you
Mhm.
need to be. But it's ultimately each like point that we had ready to discuss and talk about on some level led to a level of service.
Yeah.
And so I like that you said that, because I'm like, yeah, all these things we talked about, I didn't, like I said in that episode, we didn't even plan on us talking about service in these areas and each of these points, but it always came up.
Mhm.
So I just thought there's no other example in any other religion where we have the service that God came down as a man to die for our sins, that he served us. He washed the feet of his disciples, and that is the only religion we have where like service is not about that, and it was about the service he did. Right.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I just wanted to reiterate what you were saying there about being a man is all about service.
I like that. There are religions out there that talk about, okay, you must do this and you must do this. Maybe God will like you if you do it enough. But the
Yeah.
thing that we have in Jesus, the thing that we have in God in this biblical worldview is that God loved us so much that even though we cannot go up to him, he loved us so much that his son came, dwelt among us, washed the feet of the disciples, went to the cross, died for our sins, and rose again. That's the ultimate act of service. And it's not just, an example like Gandhi or something like that. That's where we can have transformation in our own heart.
Yeah.
And then we're called to go and follow him. And that's what the call is, to come and emulate and be like Jesus.
Yeah. And I think one last thing here is, he talked about in his advice to young men is what kind of legacy do you want to leave?
Yeah.
And I think this kind of ties in with the point I was just talking about with the worldly versus the eternal. It's like you can leave a legacy, but how far along is that going to die?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the legacy you leave for your children, your children's children who believe in Jesus Christ, well, that legacy is going to live on forever.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that just kind of ties into what kind of legacy do you want to leave?
Yeah. Well, let's tie that into our challenges. A lot of times, Matthias, I want to give one or two heady,
more philosophical.
Yeah. And then something practical. And so the two heady ones, one is, and I've done this before. I just want to encourage you men out there, and I know we got some ladies listening as well. But guys, I just want you to know that you're smart. You're smarter than what the world tells you. Therefore, to just ask questions. When you hear someone trashing the Bible or trying to explain away Jesus, just ask questions. Where's the evidence? Can you hold up that claim? Is that really true? Is that not true? I just want to encourage you to be brave and ask questions and do the research. The second philosophical one is, and you touched on that, Matthias, and I'm glad you did, going back to Brierly and talking about his dad and his legacy. Because a lot of you guys out there did not grow up with a dad like Justin did. And that, that's sad. It shouldn't be that way. But here's the question: what are we going to do about it? And the challenge is to kind of imagine the dad that you wish you had, but imagine the dad that you want to be for your kids, and then build your life in that direction.
Yeah.
Practically, here's what I want to challenge you guys to do practically. I want to challenge you to make a 3-month commitment to church. Okay. That may mean a couple of different things. Guys who have no connection to a church, you're not even sure if you're a believer yet. That's okay. But if we're really asking questions and looking, I just want to challenge you to get up off the couch on Sunday morning, find a church. Now, if you are in the Northwest Houston area, you have a big invite to Cypress Crossings Christian Church, where Matthias and I are at. Northwest Houston, Cypress area, 9:30, 11 o'clock. But look for a church, and you can find this information on their websites, who believe the Bible is the word of God, and they believe in Jesus, and they love Jesus.
Yeah.
You don't have to get into all the weeds of doctrine at that point, but make a 3-month commitment to go. Now, for guys who know Jesus, but your attendance is kind of sporadic, I want to challenge you to say, okay, unless I'm in the hospital or something, for the next 3 months, I'm going to be committed to going. And see, that swims against the tide of our culture today as well, because a lot of times the idea, Matthias, is going to church is when it's convenient for me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, a real man serves. A real man's going to think about other people, and a real man's going to say, okay, what can I give? Who can I serve? Even by being at a church service. So that's my practical challenge. Wherever you're at, make a 3-month commitment to being part of a local body of Christ. There you are.
There you are. So let's recap those challenges. First one, what was that again? Can you phrase it again?
First one, be brave, ask questions.
Be brave, ask questions. Second one, what kind of father do you want to be?
Yeah.
Think about that, and
then build toward that.
Yeah, and build toward that. Make some actionable steps. Think of the things you want to do, and okay, well, how can I accomplish those attributes if I'm not there yet?
Yeah.
Third one, go to church 3 months.
Yeah.
Try to make that commitment.
Yeah, even if you don't know God yet, just check it out.
Yeah, we know people.
Check it out.
Marshall, who goes to our church, for example, as well. He wasn't a believer. He went to church because his girlfriend was like, "If you're going to be with me, you need to come with me." Well, then he started rationally thinking about things more and more every time he went, and came to Christ. Actually, went to seminary as well, didn't he? Was it
Yeah.
Bible college? Yeah.
Yeah, he finished his degree at a Bible college, and I'm glad you brought that up, Matthias. Yeah, Marshall, we had him on the car show,
Yeah.
the
A few
car
episodes
guy.
back.
And he was able to find a group of people who loved him, even though he had not made a decision for Christ. They valued him as a human being, and he was able to ask questions. He was able to think, and I think that would summarize the question. Guys, just ask the questions. You are smarter and more capable than what the world tells you. But I just want you to know that I believe in you, and I believe that you can do this.
That's good. All righty, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of The Man Identity. We'll see you next week. Have a good one, and make sure to stick to those challenges.
Be strong.
Be strong.